Good morning. This is Josh Scherrer, author of the novel 2020, and today I am here to answer your questions about the chapter September. So, before we get started, September is one of those chapters that is kind of I don't want to say filler chapter, but it gives a little bit more of a context of what's going on, and it kind of transitions from all the events from before September to the events that will occur after. A couple of times in the book, Marlon mentions, that things are almost back to normal during this chapter, and it's kind of an overall foreshadowing of what's to come. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started with your questions. So here we go. Carla asked, first off, why did Tony leave? And so the answer to that, if you remember in the beginning of the chapter, Marlon is very distraught. He's very upset because Tony has died. And not only did Tony die, which I think to a certain extent Marlon had kind of come to terms with the fact that people were going to die, but it's the way he died. And so Tony, in his own words, said that he was bored one night. He went on patrol. He hadn't seen anything. And Tony had the personality that he was always ready to accept a challenge. If you remember when they first met Tony, of course, they found him because he survived a car accident. And then after they found him at the car and then they put him in the garage, he actually volunteered to go out on patrol unarmed to kind of show that he was willing to take risks and that he was willing to support what they needed on the farm or at the house. And so, Tony had been going on patrol for, Marlon said, for about a month. And, Tony had not seen very much action compared to Marlon and his dad. And so although it's not in the book, you can imagine that Marlon and his dad probably talked about, things that had happened in the past, talked about different events, and Tony wanted to experience some of that excitement, even though, probably not the wisest thing to do. So he went out and tried to find more roamers. And he did find another roamer. Unfortunately, that roamer cornered him and attacked him. And before Tony could kill the roamer attacked Tony, cut his forehead, and caused the TBR protozoa a chance to enter into Tony's body through the blood of that roamer, because he got cut, and then after he got cut, he killed the roamer, and as the roamer was flailing around, the blood splattered on Tony and infected him. And so, why did Tony leave? Tony left because he was in search of an adventure, and unfortunately, Tony found his end instead of an adventure. So a follow-up to that would be, Kayla asks, was Tony scared by dying at the hands of someone who saved him? I think, yeah, he probably was scared, which is why he was crying. He was probably also crying, not just because he was scared, but he was probably upset with himself because he knew he had done something very stupid, very irresponsible, and now he had to pay the ultimate sacrifice for that. And, even to the end, he was pleading for them to save him. Now, whether or not he realized that there was no possibility of being saved, I don't know, really. Even though I was the author, I wanted to leave that open for the reader to decide. So was he scared? He was probably scared. I think anybody in that situation would be scared, especially since he had sat there by himself and kind of pondered his fate for so long. Cherokee is going to ask, why do the roamers eat humans? So this question has come up in different forms for the past few Q&A sessions that we've had. And the best answer to that is if roamers are focusing on their own survival and their infection inhibits or limits their ability to rationalize like humans normally do, your first instinct is going to be to survive by finding food. And so those roamers are finding food, and it just so happens humans are food. And so that's why even at the end of the Tony section of chapter September, Marlon sees one of the roamers apparently carrying off a piece of Tony as Marlon kills that roamer because they were foraging for food. Benjamin asks why they just left that poor family there to the nomads. They could have given them one of the houses by theirs they patrolled. Benjamin, I'm going to guess that you were talking about the family in the van. So that's a good point. Marlon and his dad could have offered that, I believe his name was Mark. Mark and his family could have gone with them, could have driven to Boonville and found a house to live in. But one of the themes, of course, is what do humans do in stressful situations, and how much do people really trust each other? And if you notice in the chapter, Marlon mentions that Mark was a little bit odd, right? He went up to the truck, to the Tacoma, without any weapons. And so that either meant that there was somebody else in the van who already had a weapon pointed at the truck. So if anything happened, they would shoot at the truck. Or Mark was crazy and he might not have had a family at all. Marlon and his dad, I don't think ever actually saw the family. They just are going off of what Mark said. So given that situation, you want to be polite and courteous, to your fellow human being, but at the same time, you don't necessarily want to invite them back with you, especially since you know that you have all of these supplies you've been storing. And so if Mark really is crazy, or maybe his whole family's crazy, if they do indeed exist, it's a numbers game. They could outpower Marlon and the dad and, take over the property. So it's a calculated risks, and it's one that Marlon and his dad obviously don't take. Hannah, why did Tony die? So as I mentioned, Tony was infected and he was showing signs of infection. Marlon and his dad don't have a cure, obviously, so they tried to do what would be considered, a quote-unquote humane thing to do, and that is to end Tony's suffering by killing him. That sounds very cruel, but, when you take an animal to the vet to be euthanized, it's essentially the same thing. And given the circumstances, either Tony becomes this roamer, or he dies of his wounds and his infection and suffers, that, or they kill him. And so, they make that judgment that they have to kill Tony in order for them to secure not only themselves, but, to give Tony a little bit of peace, as odd as that sounds. So Tabitha asks, why did the man approach them unarmed, and how many children are in his van with him? So again, that is the question of the day. What was going on with that guy at the lake? We don't really know. We assume that maybe all three of his children were there, and maybe his wife. Maybe he made that story up. We don't know. It's just kind of one of those odd circumstances and one of those odd encounters that Marlon has throughout the book. Cesar asks, why does he want to talk about what happened a couple of days ago? So at the beginning of the chapter, he says, I don't want to talk. And then after that, he says again, I don't feel like writing anything. And, the book is as much about Marlon's emotional state as it is about the TBR infection and the pandemic. And so by having Marlon write down, he doesn't want to talk about it. I use that as an author to show that Marlon's mental state is so stressed that he can't even write his own thoughts anymore, right? He'd rather just block them out completely and not remember what happened. And so that's why he is very hesitant and resistant to write. Okay, Nira asks, after Marlon and his dad met the guy before they went fishing, why didn't they all stay together and try to survive? So again, I think I covered that. It's just a risk whenever you bring somebody in new. You also have to keep in mind that Tony had just died, so they had put themselves out there and risked their lives for this guy that they saved from a car accident, only for him to make a stupid decision and, essentially risk the lives of all three of them in a way. And so, that was probably weighing on their minds, and we really don't know who this character was. and how sane he was and how reliable he would have been. Okay, so why did I choose the year 2020? You know, David, that is an excellent question. I don't really know exactly why I chose 2020, other than, I wrote this back in 2013. So I wanted it set in the near future, which means that, most of what happens in the book sounded realistic in 2013 whenever I wrote it. There's nothing too extreme. If you notice, I talk about news feeds instead of like broadcast, because there for a while in 2012, 2013, it looked like over-the-air waves, broadcast, TV broadcast would kind of go obsolete and everything would go digital. Things have kind of gone digital here in 2020, but we still can pick them up by antenna. So I tried to make it as realistic as possible for the time that I wrote it. So I didn't want it too far in the future. I also didn't want to write it in the immediate present, because as you write things and time already passes, then it's not as believable, at least for me as a reader. So as the author, I made that decision. Then, I don't know, 2020 just sounded like a nice round number. I thought, okay, if anything is going to happen in our history, why not be 2020? Because 2020 is something that people would remember. And, ironically, whenever news of the pandemic started coming out in early January of this year in China and Greater Asia, I did think to myself, oh my gosh, I wrote about a pandemic in 2020, and here it is, 2020, and it sounds like there's going to be a pandemic. Now, I wasn't thinking, okay, well, what I wrote was coming true, because obviously the two pandemics are very, very different. But still, it is kind of interesting that this year that we are in happens to mirror in some ways, self-isolation, distrust of each other to a certain extent, a health risk. All those things are very similar to what happens in the book. So it was kind of an interesting circumstance, an interesting coincidence, if you will, that 2020 and 2020 are kind of lining up. All right, so good question, David. Jada asked, what made Tony turn? Did he get Romer's blood on him that made him turn? And the answer is yes. From what Marlon understands, it is the blood that will infect you. And so because because Tony had that gash on his forehead and then there was blood all over him, chances are that blood got into his open wound. And most of the time infections occur whenever you have an open wound or it gets in through your mouth or your sinuses or something. And so that is what caused him to turn jaundiced, to turn yellow. And then if you notice, his eyes were dilated, which is a sign that the infection was taking hold. Jory asked, why weren't there any roamers at the gas station? The real answer is, as the author, I just decided not to have any there because I wanted to drive the story forward. And we had already seen a scene where there were roamers at the gas station, so I didn't want to relive that scene again. And then also, maybe the roamers were on the move. It is September, so the seasons are changing. It's getting a little bit colder. Maybe they're going in a different direction. It kind of leaves it in a little bit of suspense for the reader, which is why they weren't at the gas station. So why did Marlon not feel the urge to shoot the snake in the woods? It was what Gabrielle asked. And the reason why he chose not to shoot the snake, or that he didn't have the urge, is, again, kind of one of these recurring lines that he has, is that he's cold and that he's numb. Marlon, I mean. And so by showing that something that previously would have scared him, and he would have shot without hesitation, because, when you go in the woods, you see a snake, especially out in the rural country, if it's a copperhead or whatever, a poisonous snake especially, you tend to shoot it. whether that's morally right or wrong, or if it's the ethical thing to do, you know, but that's what a lot of people in rural areas will do, especially when they go hunting or whatever. And so for Marlon to see a snake and not really react to it kind of shows that he has become desensitized to what really scares him. And so now it's not, these creepy crawly animals that scare him. It's, roamers, and even roamers may not scare him. It's probably more of the consequences of his actions that he takes against the roamers and the unknown of what will happen because of the roamers and because of the pandemic. All right, the next question is from Abraham. How did it feel to write this chapter? I actually enjoyed this chapter. Now, as the author, I knew from the beginning that Tony would be a secondary character, and a lot of times when you read a book or you watch a movie, secondary characters are expendable. They're introduced only so that they can die, or they leave, or whatever. They aren't essential to the story, and they play a very specific role. And so Tony came as almost this character replacement for the mom. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but remember, the mom dies and then Tony comes. And so when Tony comes, the dad kind of gets out of his funk, stops grieving as much. Marlon has something else to focus on. He mentions at the beginning of September that he treated him like a brother. Marlon treated Tony like a brother. And so, that absence of his family, he can kind of use Tony as that replacement for his emotions. And then Tony kind of shows how if you start taking things for granted, the roamers are starting to thin out, apparently. And so Tony takes it for granted that, hey, we might as well just find some fun, find something to do, because he was bored. When you take that risk, then you're going to suffer negative consequences. And so Tony kind of served as an example of you need to be very careful about what you choose to do, because there are still serious consequences to your actions. So that part I wrote, and I enjoyed writing that part. But then the other part about bluegrass, I really enjoyed writing because bluegrass is a real place. In fact, throughout all of these Q&A sessions, if you notice, we have in my studio here, which is, like I said at the very beginning, my garage, I've got a map of the United States, and this is actually Burt Ward from the original Batman. Apparently, my dad saw him at some point, and he signed this. And then I've got the land between the lakes in Kentucky. I've got Rock City back here, an ad for that. But then right here, actually can't really see it because it's underneath the map. It says Bluegrass Fish and Wildlife Area. So this is actual bluegrass, like from the book. And so Bluegrass Pit is right here. I know you can't really see this very well, but where my finger is Bluegrass Pit. And so in the book, when Marlon and his dad are fishing, they are actually fishing in this cove. So that scene was based on a real cove that I really fished in with my dad and actually with my brother as well. And we did catch a lot of fish there. And then I know you can't see it because of the camera, but he mentions Otter Pit. Otter Pit is actually at the southern part of the map, which is beneath the camera's view here. But it's a smaller pit. And then you have Loon Pit. Then you have Bluegrass Pit. Then you have a bunch of small pits to the east. So anyway, I really enjoyed writing this chapter, primarily because I really enjoyed inserting a real location and a real experience into the novel, right? So a lot of things that I wrote were kind of based on real life, but bluegrass, with the exception, of course, of Mark and the pandemic and the fact that roamers had eaten all of the campers at some point, the fishing part was an actual experience that I had. And I kind of, dressed it up a little bit for the book, but that was a real experience. So to answer your question, I really did enjoy writing this particular chapter. So the next question is, hang on, I lost my place. I'm sorry. From Cecilia, and Cecilia says, is Bluegrass basically empty because the helicopters from the month of June shot down every roamer and missed the survivors, or did the roamers not find any food so they left, or perhaps something else? Well, I don't really know about the helicopters. I hadn't thought about helicopters flying over Bluegrass up until you asked the question. I suppose it's possible, but more than likely, I think I mentioned in one of the earlier Q&As that the helicopters were on a mission, so it was very unlikely that they would deviate from that mission. As far as the roamers not finding any food, I kind of hinted at that in that chapter. After they carried off all the campers that were in tents, they couldn't get to the van because the van was constantly moving. So the roamers probably dissipated because there was a lack of food. And although, of course, there are still fish, Marlon didn't mention that he saw any wildlife at Bluegrass other than the fish that they caught. So it's very possible that they ate all the wildlife that was around. Or there is always the possibility that the roamers are more organized than what we realize as readers, and that they moved on to a different location for some other purpose. At this point, though, we really aren't for sure why they are gone. Devin asks, I see in the story there are a lot of animals. Can animals turn into roamers? And so I think we had this question the last Q&A, and as the author, I'd never really specified who or what TBR could infect. TBR is based on a human disease, the African sleeping sickness, which, I don't know how much of that is transmitted into animals. So the likelihood of animals getting infected is fairly small. You also have to keep in mind that if it's infection through blood or contact with, saliva or whatever of a roamer, unlike humans who might touch the blood, animals usually steer clear of things that are not their fellow animals. So the chances of an animal getting infected is very small. Whether or not they could, I guess is kind of up for debate, though. So Maria asked, why at the beginning of the chapter you say that Tony was dead? So if you look at the dates, one of the tricks, I guess you could say, that I used is, because it's in first person and because it's a journal that is really what comprises the book, I had to think of a way to explain all of the events of the book without writing them, for lack of a better word, live. Okay, and what I mean by that is it's not a first-person story as much as it is a first-person journal. And so I can't write from Marlon's perspective like, I went and saw Tony. Tony said to me, it wouldn't make much sense because it's a journal. So in a journal, I would put the dates very specifically to give Marlon time to reflect on events that had occurred in the past, and then how he felt about those events. So if you note at the beginning, I think, and I'm not 100% sure, I'd have to go back and look, but I think the first journal entry for that chapter is on September 8th, which means that you had September 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, that he didn't write anything. And so at some point in those 7 days, Tony died. And all the events that Marlon writes about on September 8th actually occur before September 8th. Okay, so that's why at the very beginning of the chapter, he says, Tony is dead, because he's writing after all of it had occurred. And then he goes back and he tells the story of how Tony dies. All right. Next is Javon. Are you still mad at Tony, or did you forgive him after what he did? So, is Marlon still mad at Tony? No, I would not say that Marlon is mad at Tony, nor would Marlon's dad be mad at Tony. I think it's more of a disappointment, and it's another way to grieve, right? Uh, I don't know how many of you have experienced loss in your life, but one of the common reactions that people have whenever they lose someone that they care about is anger. Um, you know, if for example, if I lost my father whenever I was young, which thankfully I did not, but if I did, depending on how he passed away, I might be angry at the fact he died and angry at him because he left me, right? Even if it wasn't his fault, I would be angry because he was gone. And then, of course, over time, once that grieving period passes and that period of anger passes, then you learn to accept it and you learn to remember fondly the person that passed away. And so, in many, many ways, Marlon's initial anger at Tony really was just a form of grief. And, so by the time the chapter's over, and really once we get into October and November, his grieving will kind of change, kind of like Marlon's dad's grieving changed with his wife. And so Marlon will not stay mad at Tony. No, that's a very good question. Alessandra asked, why does he want to write about what happened? So I mentioned this before. And again, it is a way to show Marlon's emotional state. Sometimes the best way to show someone's emotional state is by not showing any emotions at all, because if you get to a certain point when you can't even talk about what you're feeling, then you know that the stress level is extremely high. And that's really what's going on with Marlon. Alexandria asked, why does Marlon shoot the window just to get light inside? Like, why couldn't he get up to fix it? Really, he probably could have. If you remember, he said that particle board was nailed to the window. Particle board's just kind of this cheap type of plywood almost. And so he could have tried to pry that off. But depending on how well it was nailed in, it might take a while to pull that off or whatever. And if he's already upset because he sees just from the light of the hallway that Tony is badly hurt and most likely infected, he's not going to take the time to look for a crowbar or look for something to pry the wood off, or dig at it with his fingers until he can pull it off. So like any angry person would do, he acts on impulse, and that impulse for Marlon is just to take the shotgun that he has and just blow a hole through the window. And so that's what he does. All right, a couple more questions here. We've got Alexander. What if the snake he ran into while collecting more firewood was poisonous, and he didn't know that, and it bit him? So what would happen? So if you notice, he says that it's a black snake. Now, there are poisonous black snakes in the world, but in southern Indiana, I would venture to say probably 99% of snakes that are poisonous are not going to be black. They're usually some sort of camouflage color, almost like a diamond color or other kind of pattern. That's because they are blending in so they can strike out at their prey. A black snake, though, is usually some sort of, we usually call them rat snakes down here. And a black rat snake is not poisonous. You don't want to tangle with one necessarily because their bites do hurt and they do cause infection because they have bacteria in their mouths that could really cause a lot of pain and tissue damage. But a black snake is usually fairly harmless. Usually it's more scared of you than you are of it. I know that's kind of a cliche, but that's what we always used to say whenever we were growing up and saw snakes. So I think Marlon, having that experience, knew that it was most likely not poisonous, which is why he kind of had the reaction that he had, not to take a step back. But even so, and we said before, normally you just shoot the snake, not think anything of it. And that's because just because a snake isn't poisonous doesn't mean it doesn't creep you out. And, that's not necessarily an ethical thing or a morally right thing, or, if you are an animal lover or if you love snakes, then it sounds very ghastly to you. But a lot of people just have this innate fear of snakes. And so Marlon, of course, had that fear of snakes at one point, but he reacts the way he does, one, because he's numb, and two, he realizes it's not poisonous, so he just kind of lets it go. All right, so the last question is from Betsy, and Betsy asks, my question is, are they going to run into Mark and his family anytime soon? So I don't want to give away too much of the book, but Mark is just a peculiar character, okay? And Mark is actually in the book because as an author, I knew I wanted to get Marlon and his dad out of the compound for a while, off of the farm for a while. And so, yeah, they had gone and gotten gas. They had gotten a few other things. But they really had not done anything other than go get supplies, go on patrol. It was very monotonous, very routine. And because the roamer threat seemed to go down some, even with Tony's encounter, that proved fatal, I wanted to get them out. But to get them out, I also, as the author, had to explain the pandemic in different settings, right? Because we had mentioned before, or we had read before, that Marlon's dad went to Evansville, and Evansville was crazy. It was filled with roamers. They were all over the place during the middle of the day. So we went to Henderson. Henderson didn't seem as bad from what we know, because he was able to get to a hospital and get supplies, even talk to Marlon's brother's ex-wife. But yet it was probably still pretty chaotic there and probably very dangerous. So I wanted to get them out, but at the same time, I couldn't just say, oh, they went out and they went fishing. I needed to explain why they were able to go to Bluegrass, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so by using Mark was able to tell the story, tell the history of Bluegrass as the outbreak occurred. And so Mark served as kind of this narrative piece to explain, yeah, there were a lot of people around here, but the roamers ate them or carried them off. They're gone. And we're really the only survivors in this area. But we haven't seen any roamers lately. We don't really know what happened. And so Mark was really just a way to explain how it was possible for Marlon and his dad to go fishing at Bluegrass. So that is a good question, Betsy. I'm glad that you asked it. And as always, I am always happy to read your questions. You guys really asked some very difficult and thought-provoking questions. And a lot of them, and I've said this before, a lot of them I haven't thought of as the author, and I've not really even thought of them as a reader, reading my own book either. And so I know that we've got a few months left, a few chapters left. So I look forward to hearing the rest of your questions. Until then, take care.